It is now my pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker for the evening. Prior to tonight, now I should have done my due diligence, as my husband always says in his business, and read about a talk Stephanie Gray had given in front of Google. And apparently, from what I've heard so many people tell me about how incredibly powerful this talk was, that I'm going to Google Stephanie Gray speaking to Google when I leave here, because I can't wait to hear this talk, but I suggest you do too, because I can't imagine the kind of courage it took to give that talk about life to those individuals. I understand they also heard from Cecile Richards, the former president and CEO of Planned Parenthood, and she was not nearly as well received, so that's pretty cool. But Stephanie Gray, she's an internationally known speaker. She's from Canada, and she gave that talk at headquarters of Google, and she's also debated abortion advocates, including abortion doctors all around the world. Stephanie likes to say that if she weren't, now here's a question, if you were going to ask her, what would you do if you weren't doing this work? Here's what she would do. I love this. She says if she were not fighting abortion, she would be Mary Poppins in the daily parade at Disneyland. Or she would be a music therapist, or maybe both. Stephanie loves to play the ukulele, which she has named Joy. She has her own. And when she travels with Joy, people see the case, they ask, is that a violin you have? And she says, no, it's even better. It's a ukulele. And when the questioner looks surprised, she says, a violin is inherently a sad instrument, but a ukulele is a happy instrument. It's kind of like the accordion. So I hope did you bring joy with you tonight, Stephanie? Dang. Oh, well, next time. But in a world of much darkness, we could use a little more joy, right? No pun intended. On that note, please help me welcome Stephanie Gray.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, yes, I maxed out my carry-on capacity today, so there was no room for joy. So she's back in Canada. Anyways, I wanted to begin with a quote from Edward Everett Hale, who once said, "I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something that I can do." When it comes to the injustice of abortion in our midst, and we think about the 1 million children killed every year here in America, we think of the over 50 million who have lost their lives since abortion became legal here. We think of the 40 million children around the world killed annually by abortion. And we think of that, it can be so tempting to think, I am only one, I cannot do everything. But tonight what I want us to do is change our perspective. I want us to think instead of the power of one. I want us to think about how we can do something, and that it's our inability to do everything that should compel us to do the something that we can do. Tonight in particular, I want to reflect on the right disposition we need to have as our starting point when it comes to using the power of our one. The second thing I want to do is equip you with some of the experience I've had engaging the culture and the approaches that I have found particularly helpful so that when we encounter others, we can be winsome and we can be persuasive. And then I'm going to conclude with some stories of people that I've met over the years who have used their power of one very well. In terms of the right disposition we need to have when engaging people on the topic of abortion, what comes to mind is a book that one of my spiritual directors had me read several years ago called The Soul of the Apostolate. How many of you have heard of that book, The Soul of the Apostolate? So we have a couple hands going up. I highly recommend it. And the idea of this book is that when you are involved in apostolic activity, when you are involved in ministry-based work, whether that's officially, such as being involved with the Pro-Life Action Ministries, or even unofficially in your daily life, trying to be a witness for Christ, evangelizing others. When we are involved in that, there can be this tendency to focus on the scripture passage, the harvest is plentiful, but what? The laborers are few. See, we all know that passage. But then here's what happens. We make up the rest of how that passage goes. We think it goes, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few, so get on out into the harvest and do all the labor the other laborers aren't around for. And that is not how that passage ends. The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. So what? How does it go? Pray. Pray, therefore, that the Lord of the harvest will send more laborers into the harvest. The soul of the apostolate, the heart of ministry-based activity, is to begin with contemplation prior to action. To be still, to know that God is God, to allow the Holy Spirit to consume us, to overwhelm us, and let that flow into our work. But if we get focused on the lack of people and our own involvement in the idea that I need to do more, then two dangerous things happen. The first dangerous thing that happens is if I take other people's jobs upon myself, there's no longer a void for them to observe. If they don't see the void, they'll never step forward and fulfill that position themselves. The second dangerous thing that happens is as I take more work upon myself, I have to cut back in other areas, like prayer. And if I do that, I become a danger, a threat to the very ministry-based work that I'm doing. There's a beautiful illustration in the book by St. Bernard who said we are to be reservoirs and not channels. Reservoirs and not channels. If we think about those two bodies of water, the channel, the water just flows through. That's like the busy soul going, doing, rarely taking time to pray. The reservoir is very different. With a reservoir, water fills up, and then the excess overflows. And that is to be our disposition when we go forward in using our power of one, beginning with the power of prayer. One of the things I like to do is just take simple scripture passages and turn them into repetitive prayers we can bring silently to our conversations. I like to use the passage that Mary used when she went to visit Elizabeth. And I think the most pro-life passage in the scriptures is that exchange between Mary and Elizabeth, when Mary enters Elizabeth's home. But a lot of times people think the most pro-life element of that passage is John the Baptist, leaping in Elizabeth's womb for joy. But I don't think that's it. I think the most powerful pro-life reference in that exchange is not John the Baptist. It's with why John the Baptist leapt for joy. It's because when Mary entered Elizabeth's home, she didn't enter alone. She entered with God Almighty in her womb as the first trimester embryo, likely not yet implanted. And that was why John the Baptist leapt for joy, because Jesus was present. And so when Elizabeth declares, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb," Mary's reaction is to say, "My soul magnifies the Lord." And that can be the prayer we bring to every encounter. Lord, may I magnify you in this encounter. May I magnify the Lord. If you think about it, we're all a blend of good bits and bad bits. We've got our virtue, but we've also got our vice. And we want to make sure that we magnify the virtue, that as image bearers, that we magnify God in our exchange with the other. When you think about magnifying something, to magnify does not change what something looks like. To magnify is to change where we look. It's to zoom in a particular part. Another passage that I like to pray is the one of the blind man who called out to Jesus, "Lord, that I may see." And how often we're dialoguing with people where we don't know where they've come from. We don't know what their personal life story has been. So that can become our prayer. Lord, that I may see where this person is coming from. Lord, that I may see what they most desperately need to hear or experience in this encounter. And once the soul of our apostolate has been prayer, then we're ready from contemplation for action. And when we begin to take action, what's important is that we not just win the argument, but that we also win the person. That we be engaging, persuasive, and winsome. When Jesus interacted with people throughout the scriptures, time and again, we see Jesus asking questions and telling stories. And I have found those two tactics of asking questions and telling stories to be profoundly impactful, profoundly engaging when interacting with others. And so I want to give you a number of examples of how asking questions and telling stories has been a positive and powerful tool in trying to not just win an argument, but win a person. A few years ago, I was on a college campus in Florida. A student came up to the microphone during Q&A, and he said, my stepmom had an abortion because she was told her baby was going to die at birth. Are you telling me she was wrong? And so my first reaction was to express sympathy. I said, I am sorry for the suffering that your stepmom experienced, and I don't pretend to know what that must have been like. And I said, your question is a fair one. I said, if you'll bear with me, I think I can best answer your question by asking you a question, by engaging you in a dialogue. But I realize that's in front of a whole audience. So are you okay with that? Do you mind if I ask you a few questions? He said, sure, go ahead, that's fine. So I said, okay. I said, I want you to imagine this. I said, imagine someone you love that you visit every summer. It's like a highlight of your year. You go and you visit this loved one, whether it's a relative or friend, childhood classmate. You go and visit this person every year in the opposite end of the country. And you look forward to it every summer. And this person calls you up and they say, we can't hang out next summer. And you say, why? And they say, because I'm not going to be here. I've just been diagnosed with cancer and I've got 4 weeks left to live. I looked at the student, having told that very little made-up story, and I asked him a question. I said, would you wait until week 3, day 6, to hop on a plane and go say goodbye to that person you love? Or, I said, would you take the next flight out and savor every moment of every day of the next 4 weeks with the person that you love? And he said, well, the second option. And I said, me too. I said, here's what I think this says about us. What I think this says about you and me is that we recognize when we have a limited amount of time left with someone we love, we want to maximize the minimal time we have. We don't want to cut short the already short time that we have. I said, bearing that in mind, now let's look at that in light of the question you asked me and the experience your stepmom found herself in. Before she was told her baby was going to die at birth, she probably thought she had maybe 50 years with her child. And in one moment of being told, maybe 20 weeks along, that her baby would die at birth in 20 more weeks, in one moment, she went from having 50 years to only 20 weeks. I said, why would we want to cut short the already short time we have? Wouldn't we want to maximize the minimal time and savor every moment of every day of the next 20 weeks with a child that we love? Now, would there be grief and sorrow at that child's death in 20 weeks? Absolutely. But if you have an abortion, would there be grief and sorrow at that child's death? Yes. And in both cases, when the first Christmas comes, will there be grief and sorrow? Yes. And the first birthday, grief and sorrow? Yes. So when you have the abortion, you do not rob yourself of the grief and the sorrow, but you do rob yourself of the gift of time. Questions, stories. How can these make our message more clear so that it resonates in the heart of the person that we're dialoguing with? When it comes to a poor prenatal diagnosis, not only do we need to address the ones where the child is likely to die at birth, but then there are circumstances where the child will live a full life, but a different life because of physical or genetic difference. And what story can we tell people to help them see that perceived negative situation, in fact, as a positive one? Well, I like to tell people the story of Rick Guidotti, a photographer who's helping change people's perspective when it comes to poor prenatal diagnosis. And we'll watch a little video here to further illustrate his story.
Rick Guidotti's life has been all about beauty and the power of images. He spent years as a fashion photographer in Milan, Paris, and with a studio in New York, always shooting what fashion editors decreed to be beauty. Then, 15 years ago, when he considered photographing a woman with a disability, he was shocked at images in medical textbooks he consulted. Where, he asked, is the humanity?
It doesn't work like this. That doesn't help. This doesn't help. This is sad.
I haven't looked at this book in 25
It's terrifying.
years.
There's other ways to present this. I've spoken to so many genetic counselors that have a family in front of them, and they say, okay, this is what your daughter's going to have. Read this. And they cover up the photograph so because it'll freak the family right out. There's got to be something else that we can do. There's got to be another way to present that information to that family. So this is Kiara. Now,
Those
Kiara,
medical pictures changed his life. Ever since then, he has devoted his talent to the disabled. People like Kiara. She has albinism, a congenital disorder that not only affects pigmentation, but vision.
This is stunning.
Oh, it's a great photograph. Yeah, I love the photograph. But they told her, no, don't be a dancer. You don't have enough vision to follow the choreography. You'll never dance in chorus. Find another dream. She said no. She's New Zealand's Celtic dance champion.
His pictures are nothing short of stunning and are being exhibited in public places around the world, aimed at changing how we see people who appear different. But he started with albinism.
Who was your first person you photographed and you thought, oh, I see something different?
Yeah. Well, it was Christine. Christine walked into the studio, and she's beautiful. She has long white hair, pale skin. But she walks in like that. No eye contact, no one-word answers. This kid was teased every single day in her life. And it was like holding up a mirror and saying, look at yourself, you're magnificent. And she saw it, and she just exploded, that's her. I mean, she's so beautiful. And she changed right in front of the lens.
She was nothing like the pictures of albinism he had found in medical textbooks.
These are the images that I saw, but I also not only saw those images, I saw like freak circus albino families, and I was like, oh, this is horrible. And then of course all the movie references.
Always his freaks.
Usually the bad guy, usually the villain, the evil albino.
He approached other women who had been born with albinism, people like Margaret Breed.
I definitely hadn't seen myself like that before. When he approached me and said, I want to photograph you, you're beautiful, definitely hadn't been in my vocabulary for thinking about myself.
I started photographing these kids and hearing their stories and these adults. So I called Life magazine and said, hey, I've got this great story.
6 weeks later, it was a major spread in Life magazine.
Well, then someone said, it's not just about people with albinism, it's about celebrating all difference. Would you come and photograph our families at our Chromosome 18 conference? It was in San Antonio. And I'm thinking, what the hell is a Chromosome 18 anomaly? I had no idea.
Chromosome 18 anomaly is a genetic defect that can produce a whole range of severe malformations.
Were you shocked?
It was like I got slapped in the head, punched in the stomach, it ended. I thought, what happens if we're having a baby? And we find out that this baby is born with a chromosome 18, and that's what you see.
Can you make beauty out of a trisomy 18?
Well, no, there's gorgeousness there. That's gorgeous kid. That's Pauline. That's Rebecca. These kids are superb. Ellington. These are all from the chromosome 18. Remy. She's stunning. She's amazing.
Rick is the subject of a film to be released later this year. Award-winning documentarian Joanna Rudnick followed him to a conference of families whose children have chromosome 18 anomalies.
Rick took pictures of him the way I saw him. Not the way everybody else saw him, but the way I saw him. And it was the first time I had somebody tell me how beautiful he was. He didn't tell me he was small. He didn't tell me he had fat cheeks from his steroids. And they were these most beautiful pictures of this blue-eyed little baby.
Have you seen the positive exposure presentation yet?
Yes, we have.
So last year,
Yes,
right?
last year we saw it.
Guidati's hope lies in young medical students. He's a regular on campuses around the country.
I really want to hear your opinion on this. The idea is to put the humanity, make sure that humanity is in medicine, to make sure that we see not a disease, a diagnosis, but a human being. I know we all know that there's a lot of science in medicine, but I can assure you there's a lot of art in medicine as well. That is so important it's not what you're treating, it's who you're treating.
It's not what you're treating, it's who you're treating. A story that helps change our perspective. The reality is in the abortion debate, it's often centered around whether the preborn child is a what or a who. And so the question I'm always asking myself is, how do I best communicate that the preborn child is a who like you or me? That they are unrepeatable, that they are irreplaceable, and that their lives began at the moment of fertilization, even though they looked nothing like us now when they were then in that moment. How do we communicate that? Well, remembering the power of stories. I was once in a debate at the University of Victoria, the western part of Canada, close to where I live. And I was debating a philosophy professor, and just before the debate began, a group of pro-abortion protesters marched in with large placards, and I was a little worried when I saw them, not because they were there, but because typically they're disruptive. So I thought, I hope they're quiet. Well, thankfully, even with their placards that were kind of bulky, they all took seats and they were quiet. And I thought, well, this is good. My debate opponent had said ladies first, so I was really happy because I like to set the tone, so I got to go first. And so about 10 minutes into my opening remarks, I got to the part of my presentation where I was communicating the preborn child as a who, where I was making the case that life begins at fertilization. And I used a story that I have found particularly helpful to get that point across. And so I said to the students, if any of you have been to a wedding recently, you might have experienced getting to your table and noticing a little camera on your table. And that camera is a technology making a comeback, a Polaroid camera. And the bride and groom want you to take photos of their day from your perspective. So I made sure the students were familiar indeed with a Polaroid camera, and they indeed were familiar, that little camera case, and you put the white cards in and you snap a photo and the card comes out. I said to the students, what do you see on that card initially? And someone said, like, brown smudges. I said, right, black or brown? And then I said, what do you do? And then half the audience raised their hand and kind of shook their hand like this. And I thought, okay. So I said, I want you to imagine that instead of going to a wedding where there's a Polaroid camera, you yourself already have a Polaroid camera and you go on vacation. And I said to the students, I want you to imagine that you go on vacation to where my dad is from, which is not Canada. Right, my dad's from Scotland. Okay, right. He came to Canada in the 1970s, so he's got a great Scottish accent. Right, so I said to these students, imagine, right, you go to Scotland, a very, very famous place in Scotland. It's called Loch Ness. So I asked a question. I said, what's in Loch Ness? And someone said, the monster. And I was like, right. My grandma, she kind of was hard of sight. She was not hard of hearing, hard of sight. She had a hard time seeing. But she swore out in the distance, she could clearly see the Loch Ness monster. So I said to these students, imagine you're on a boat tour of Loch Ness, Loch meaning lake, and you're taking photos with a Polaroid camera. And I said, imagine maybe a couple hours into your boat tour, when you look over your shoulder, you suddenly see Nessie. The humps, the bumps, they're sticking out of the water. So you point your Polaroid in that direction, you snap a photo, and the little card comes out. Now, just as the card comes out, Nessie goes underwater. Having told my story, I asked the students a question. Would you be disappointed she's disappeared? And a couple of them said yes. And I said, okay, well, what would console you in your frustration that she's gone? And someone said, well, you're holding the picture. I said, right. And you're realizing in this moment, that photo is not for your photo album. That photo is gold, that you have student debt, and you're going to sell this to newspapers and magazines and make a whole whack load of money, proving that what was thought to be a myth is reality. So I said, you start shaking this little card, super excited. And let's imagine, as I embellished my story in further detail, I said, let's imagine that a passenger of this boat tour with you has never seen a Polaroid camera, doesn't know how it works. So they excitedly grab the card from you to have a look at Nessie. But when they look at the card, they see those black-brown smudges. And they incorrectly presume the photo didn't take properly. And so with great disappointment, they rip it and toss it in the lake. Would you be upset? Okay, right, my Scottish temper would come out. We Scots are known as having a wee bit of a fiery temper. That's why Scottish people, they've got redheads. Right? Any gingers in the room, we all know you've got a temper. Right, so imagine that Scottish temper comes out. You get angry at the person and they look at you like you're crazy. And they say, yeah, it was just brown smudges. Why do you like brown smudges so much? And I said to the students, you would likely reply, it wasn't just brown smudges. Everything about the image of the Loch Ness monster was captured in an instant. It just needed time to develop. And at that moment, all my placard-waiting protesters leapt up and started chanting, my body, my choice, my body, my choice, for 40 minutes. until security made them leave and the debate could resume. But their reaction reinforced the power of the story. That the story made the point abundantly clear that we began our lives at the moment of fertilization in that instant, and we just needed time to develop. And so their reaction was to suppress because it was so powerful. Another encounter I had was with a student, again, in Florida a few years ago. The student came up to me, and she knew the power of questions because she said, quite snarkily, because she wasn't pro-life, she was pro-abortion, she said, "I have a question for you. Do you sit under acorns for shade?" Now, I knew where she was going, but I thought, I'm going to humor her. I'm not going to, so I said, "Oh, no, I don't." And she said, "Yeah, exactly. And just as an acorn isn't an oak tree, a fetus isn't a human." So I thought for a moment, and then I said, well, that's really interesting. If you don't want to compliment or be too negative about something, interesting is a great word to drop, Oh, that was a really interesting performance. Yeah. So I said, that's a really interesting question. I said, "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" She said, "Go ahead." I said, "Would you ever take the keys of your car, give them to a 5-year-old child, and tell the child to go for a drive?" She said, "No, of course not. What's your point?" And I said, "Well, it sounds to me like you acknowledge that the 5-year-old, because she's not an adult, is incapable of doing what adults can do, namely drive a car, so you're not going to give your keys. Is the 5-year-old still a human?" She said, "Yes. What's your point?" I said, "The acorn is a very immature oak. It's like the baby of the adult. And adults can provide shade, but babies can't. And so I don't sit under acorns for shade because they're immature oaks. They're not yet the adult which provides shade. But just as the acorn is of the oak family, in the same way, the fetus, like the 5-year-old, is the baby, the younger version of the adults in the species, and can't do what the adults can do, drive a car or whatever the case may be. But just as the acorn is of the oak family, the fetus, or 5-year-old, is of the human family. Just isn't the adult version. But if we believe in human rights, it doesn't matter whether you're an adult or a child. What matters is if you're human. In another situation, I found myself debating a different philosophy professor, and he made a different type of argument in defending abortion. Instead of denying that preborn children are humans, he made the argument that living human persons may have a right to life, but don't have a right to use another living human person's body. And so he got up in front of 200 students and he said, "I'm going to suggest all of you consider the following scenario." He said, imagine it's several years into the future and you have a child. You love your child. Your child is maybe 10 or 12 years old, and your child has kidney disease. And your child is going to die unless he gets a kidney transplant. Now, I want you to imagine, he said to all of these students, that you as the parent seem to have the right body type to be able to match your child's body and donate one of your kidneys, and you're the only person in the world who could successfully do this. He said to the students, understanding the power of both stories and questions, he said, "Would it be nice of you to give one of your kidneys to your child?" Yeah. Would it kill you to give one of your kidneys to your child? No. Would it save your child to give one of your kidneys to your child? Yes. But should the law force you, as a parent, to give one of your kidneys to your child? No, he said, the law should not. And just as the law should not force a parent to give their kidney to their child, the law should not force a parent to give their uterus to their child. What do we do? Well, remembering my first point, we pray hard. Yeah, so see, I was not prepared for what that professor was going to raise. And so I was sitting in front of this audience taking notes, but I was faking it. I was looking calm, cool, and collected externally and pretending I was writing, but inside kind of dying, thinking, I'm not sure what to say to this guy. And so I began to pray, calling on the Holy Spirit to give me some divine inspiration, and I sensed God speak to me. Not audibly, but very distinctly. And I sensed God say the following to me: Stephanie, I made the uterus for a different purpose. Now, that's all he gave me. So I had to just keep thinking about it over and over. I was like, okay, but what do you mean by that? And it's like, that's all I'm getting. Okay. So after about, 10 more minutes of the professor speaking and him concluding, it was like the moment of epiphany came at the right time. And I got up and I said, Professor Snedden makes a very, very compelling argument. Compliment where you can. I said, until we ask ourselves a question. And the question we have to ask ourselves is this: what is the nature and purpose of the kidney versus the nature and purpose of the uterus? Because when we ask and answer that question, we come to see why the parent is not or should not be legally obligated to give one, but should be obligated to give the other. I said, the kidney exists in my body for my body. I said, my uterus is different. My uterus exists in my body every single month, getting ready for someone else's body. I said, I can live without my uterus, but my offspring cannot. It's an organ unique from all my other ones in that it exists more for them than for me, and therefore they can claim a right to that in a way they can't claim a right to the kidney. It was reported back to me several days later that the professor said to his class the next morning that he was up all night trying to think of a response. So I like to say that reinforces, yes, the power of questions, but also the power of prayer. On in another encounter, again on a college campus, I was doing Q&A, and a student came up to the microphone and she said, what about rape? Sure, if you're talking about a woman consents to sex, maybe fine, she can't have an abortion. But if someone hasn't consented, they're now pregnant with a rapist child, they've already been victimized once, shouldn't they be allowed to have an abortion? And I'm asked that question a lot, including when I was on one of my frequent flights and the passenger next to me asked me what I do for a living, and that's always fun when the plane takes off and they've got nowhere to go. So I said, well, I give talks about abortion. What do you think about abortion? And he said that he was in favor of it. I said, when? He said, in cases of rape. And so my typical answer, as it was for him, was to say, well, I agree with you that rape is a horrible evil, an injustice for which there really aren't any words. And I think we need more serious consequences for the criminals who commit this egregious crime. The question, I said to him, that I have to ask myself is this: is it fair to give the death penalty to the innocent child? And he looked at me and he said, that's good. He's like, I never thought of it like that. Going back now, that girl, not so convinced by what I thought was a compelling question. She's like, yeah, but. So I thought, okay, maybe she needs more than a question. Maybe she needs a story. I've got one of those. So I said, imagine this. It's always how I introduce my stories. I said, imagine this. I said, imagine you have someone who has consensual sex with her husband on, let's say, Monday. And I said the following day, she's walking home from work and raped by a stranger. So then 1 month passes and she gets a positive pregnancy test. And as she's looking at that test, she doesn't know whether the father of her child is her husband or the rapist. So I said, let's imagine that she hopes it's her husband's child. She carries on with the pregnancy. And after the baby is born, they do a paternity test. Test results come back and reveal the child's father is not her husband. It's the rapist. I ended my story with a question. I said, would we allow that woman or anyone to kill the newborn child because of the father's crime? And she said, well, no. And I said, why then would we allow someone to kill the preborn child because of the father's crime? And she said, yeah, but, that's made up. That would never happen. So I thought, oh, I've got more. So I said, well, actually, the New York Times, many years ago now, had this interview with an abortionist by the name of Dr. Wickland. And this abortionist still very much was in favor of abortion. And yet, interestingly, at one point in the interview, it said Dr. Wicklund described her horror when she aborted the pregnancy of a woman who had been raped, only to discover after examining the removed tissue that the pregnancy was further along than she or the woman had thought, and that she had just aborted an embryo the woman and her husband had conceived together. Even the abortionist was horrified. Taking now the real life story, ending that with a question, I said, if it's horrifying to kill a child conceived in love, isn't it equally horrifying to kill a child conceived in violence? Because in both situations, the common denominator is the presence of a child. And she looked at me and said, yeah, but, and I thought, nothing's getting through to her. And I noticed a long line of students behind her, and so I said, I would be happy to address more of your comments and thoughts, but in fairness to all the people behind you, I'm going to have to take their questions. So please come up to me at the end and we can talk one-on-one, but I'm going to have to let them ask questions too. She respected that. She sat down. The event concludes. As soon as it's done, boom, she's at the podium. She wants to keep talking. And as she and I were carrying the conversation on, I thought, I'm asking great questions and I'm making great stories, and if this stuff isn't getting through to her up here, maybe it's because the problem isn't there. Maybe the problem's here. And I started to wonder if possibly I could be speaking to a victim of sexual assault. And so at one point in our encounter, I said, I have a friend who was molested as a child. I'm one of about 5 people in our circle of friends who knows this. I said, to this day, my friend has never told her parents. And I and a few others only know because she was triggered years later and that traumatized her. And so she started to disclose this to a few of us. And I said, in journeying with my friend to get help, because I knew I could be a friend but not a counselor. And so I offered to go to the professional with her. And I said, in journeying with her to get help, and I said, I'll be upfront. She never got pregnant. She was too young. I said, in walking with her, it became very clear to me that when someone has been sexually assaulted, they've been traumatized by that. And whether they get pregnant or not, have an abortion or not, the abortion's not going to take that trauma away. And she looked at me with a deep sadness in her eyes and said, yeah, 10 years and counting. And I looked at her and I said, I am so sorry for your suffering. And in that moment, the whole course of our conversation changed. I set aside all my arguments, all my apologetics, and just met her where she was at in her story. I asked her questions like, are you okay? Is the person who hurt you still in your life? Do you feel safe? I asked her a question like, do you feel you've had adequate counseling? Can I help connect you to a place locally that could be of support? And as I saw this girl transform before my eyes, I was reminded of something my friends at Justice for All have said. When someone asks about rape, they're not asking if the baby is human. They're asking if the pro-lifer is human. Do we care as much for the person in front of us as we rightly care for the child in the womb? I'm reminded of a powerful illustration in the book Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. Imagine I have 3 buckets of water in front of me. I put my left hand in one bucket of water, of cold water. I put my right hand in the bucket of hot water, and nothing's in the middle bucket. Now imagine when I take my right hand out of the hot water and put it in the middle bucket, I'm going to think the new bucket of water is what? Cold. And when I take my left hand out of the cold water and I put it in the new bucket of water, I think it's going to be hot. Both hands are actually wrong. Objectively, it's lukewarm. But the previous experience is coloring the present interpretation. And when we're interacting with someone, if we're having a hard time getting through to them, that's where we want to pause and ask ourselves, what temperature was the bucket of water they were in before I met them? Where are they coming from? What's their story? And maybe we need to travel from the head to the heart, to not just win the argument, but to win them. And so some good open-ended questions that will be more heart-oriented are things like, I'm curious, where does your passion come from? Or do you know anyone who's experienced poverty, rape, abortion, whatever it is that they suggest? Or to say, I'm curious, what's your earliest memory of learning about abortion, and what did you think then? When did it change? Oh, why did it change? And those answers might involve sharing very personal stories that can help explain where they're coming from. There's much more I could say about being winsome, engaging, using questions and stories. Time doesn't permit it, but I will emphasize that outside, some of you have already received it, but there are copies of my book here tonight that you can get. But I want to wrap up with a few stories of people who have used their power of one to make a difference. I have a friend who used to work in construction, and he was telling me that one afternoon after driving away from a job site, he had a colleague in the truck, and he just brought up the topic of abortion. And his colleague said he sat on the fence. And so my friend just started using the apologetics that I gave you, and within about 15, 20 minutes, this colleague of his had got off the fence and become pro-life. A few days later, my colleague went to another construction site, and he noticed when he arrived that there was a big discussion happening amongst all his colleagues. Or my friend, the construction worker, saw this debate happening amongst the colleagues. And we got closer, he realized they were all talking about abortion. And he thought to himself, oh, I don't feel like another debate today. But he didn't have to debate because the colleague he'd spoken to a few days before was in that crowd, and he was giving to those guys all the arguments my friend had given him a few days prior. The power of one. Someone who'd been in my audience is an accountant. She told me that she just went to work one day and she kind of used the presentation as an impetus to bring up the topic and say, oh, I heard this woman give an anti-abortion talk, and I've never asked you, what do you think about abortion? And so they had a little conversation. She shared what she'd learned, and again, this woman got off the fence and became pro-life. I'm reminded of a nurse that I met a few years ago. She told me that she worked in a small town and did not want to give out the morning after pill, but she was being pressured by her employer to do so. So much so that she was being threatened with losing her job if she refused to comply with their wishes. Well, thankfully, this woman was willing to lose her job, but thankfully she was also willing to not go down without a fight. And so she was going to work hard to try to keep her job, but certainly never compromise her conscience. And she fought so hard and so well that her employer was forced to comply with her standard and not force her to give out the morning after pill. And her power of one gets even better. Not only in standing her ground was her right protected and respected, but several of her colleagues who were nurses had been involved with abortions, and they stopped doing abortions as a result of her courageous stance. I'm also reminded of a few years ago, an audience member came up to me, an obstetrician gynecologist, and he said, you know, when you talk about the power of questions, it's true. He said, I had a patient come to me. Very tragically, this woman had experienced several miscarriages, one which was late, as well as a stillbirth. She'd gone through a lot of trauma with losing children, and she came to me for a pregnancy test, and it came back positive. And when I told her that she was pregnant again, she said, I want an abortion. And he thought, that made no sense to me. Like, I journeyed with this woman through all these child losses. I knew she wanted a child. Why would she want an abortion? He said, then I started to think, maybe she's afraid of losing another child. And before she bonds, before she gets close again, she just wants to have an abortion. He thought, how do I help her see that's not going to solve the problem? He said, I just looked at her as I was having all these thoughts in my mind. I just looked at her and I said, tell me again what it was like when you had those miscarriages. Tell me again what your experience was like after the stillbirth. Let's revisit that. And so she said, well, I was depressed. I didn't want to get out of bed. I was angry. I was suicidal. And once she began to relive all of that, he said to her, now what impact do you think having an abortion will have on you? And then it was like a light bulb went off in her mind, and she said, I never thought of it that way. The power of a question, the power of one. The final story I want to leave you with is of a pregnancy center that reached out to me a couple years ago. They wanted to improve their interaction with clients and the types of questions they ask. And when I met with them, I said, not all questions are equal. Pro-lifers have a tendency to ask this question we think is effective, where we say to an abortion supporter, what if someone aborted you? And we like to ask that question because we think, what if someone aborted me? And because our lives are so great, And we have so many good friends and family and church community. We know God, that we think, how tragic would it be if I weren't here? But our experience is often not theirs. And when you ask some people, what if someone aborted you? You know what you hear back? I wish they had. Or I wouldn't care. And so we ask a question expecting a certain response because we're coming from our bubble. The reason we ask that question is because we love ourselves and we think if they love themselves, they'll come to the right answer. So I said to these counselors, what we want to do is help them think of someone that they do love. To say to someone, can you tell me, is there someone you're really close to? Someone you're romantically involved with, or a friend or a family member, someone you're really close to? Tell me about them. And watch their face light up as they talk about that person. And then ask, what if someone aborted them? Now you're going to get a different reaction. A couple days later, one of those counselors called me and said, you're not going to believe what happened. A client called us. She wanted to have an abortion. And as we're talking over the phone, I asked the client what she does. And she mentioned that she works at a daycare. And I said, well, tell me about it. And she talked about the kids and how much fun they were and how her work life was very fulfilling. And so I said to her, just imagine if some of those children weren't in your daycare because of abortion. How would you feel about that? The conversation continued. A day or so after that, the client called back and said she didn't want to have the abortion. And when the counselor asked why or what influenced her, the client said, it was that question you asked where I had to think about the kids in daycare and if one of them were missing because of abortion. The power of questions. And so as we wrap up this evening and you're given an opportunity in just a few moments to make a financial contribution, I want you to think not, I'm only one, I can't give everything. But instead, I want you to think about the power of your one. I am one. I can give something. And because I can't give or do everything, I will not refuse to give and do the something that I can. Thank you very much.